So more and more, I'm persuaded that we will never, ever, ever reach our fullest potential in neighborhoods and communities until we're able to have really difficult conversations. And so I invite you today to join me in a difficult conversation. And so there were some things I will ask you and I'll expect a response, right? And so let's practice. By a round of applause. Good, that will tell me that there's your yes. And so as you look at the picture on the wall, I'm going to ask you a question about potential. Tell me, as you think about potential, which of us have the most potential? This guy you're looking at on the screen, who's well clean shaven, in his prep boy tie, Oxford collar shirt, or this guy with his authentic Yankees hat, Brooklyn paraphernalia, scruffy beard, and of course the swag that goes with it. Now you have to be really honest with yourself. Think about it in your own head as you think about potential. Which of us have more potential? Is it the guy you see in the picture? Come on, round of applause. Or is it this guy who's standing here? It's okay, you chose him over me, but I expected that. And so that guy is me, as is obvious to some of you. But oftentimes, as an African-American man growing up in American society, I have to be 2 or 3 different people in order to meet people's expectation of who has potential or who is worthy. And so, as you notice, I've never once said to you, potential for what? Is it potential for success? Is it potential to get a job? Or is it potential to change the world as we know it? And so in each of your mind, there was some automatic set of criteria that made him more worthy of potential than me. Whether it was that he fit a mold, whether he was clean shaven like corporations often require you to be, or whether it was that you assume that he has some degree or some set of education. And so in each of our mind, we come to our own set of criteria based on what we were taught, based on the truths that were told to us, and we begin to proceed in our own behavior and interaction with people based on those set of what we call reality or our own knowledges. Well, have you ever taken time to think about how you think about what you think about? I didn't really make that up. There's actually a formal term for it. It's called metacognition. It's the process of not accepting what you think about to be true or fact, but to think about why you think about it that way. You know, have you ever had a conversation with somebody and they say, well, I disagree with that. And you actually never stop to think about why they disagree with it because you absolutely believe that you're right. And so metacognition is actually a rare set of activities because most people never stop to think about why it is true to you and why it's a reality to you. We then just proceed from that thought right to our actions. And so oftentimes the only way to make somebody change how they think is the introduction of a divergent thought. And so you have to introduce the divergent thought, and when somebody introduces a divergent thought to you and truly you take it in and you think about it, it creates a level of discomfort. In illustration, it will be almost like me putting ice cubes in my left hand and a ball of fire in my right hand. My first inclination is to resolve the discourse, and that's called cognitive dissonance. It means that you have 2 competing thoughts that exist in your head at the same time, and it really starts to make you uncomfortable. How many of you have ever had the experience where somebody introduces something to you that works against what you fundamentally believe is the absolute truth? So that feeling of discomfort is called cognitive dissonance. It means that somebody's introduced you to something that you have to resolve. And it's in the human nature to move forward to resolving that conflict. And so I'll introduce you to this guy. This guy was born as Carver's George. And you may say to yourself, well, How do you say that a person is born as Carver's George? In the English language, that would mean that he was born as property to someone else. And that's because he was. Carver's George was born in Diamond Grove, Missouri, not too far from here, in the mid-1800s, and born into slavery. And his family was sold off, and so he was the sole one of his family left in servitude to the Carver family. And he actually lived and died in 1943, and so you would realize 43 really wasn't all that long ago. It was barely my mother's generation ago. And so Carver's George would have been amongst many in the country who would have believed to absolutely not have potential to do anything. Nothing life-changing. The common belief would have been that not only was he not intellectual, but he wasn't even a man. He probably would not have had as much intellect as would a bull or a donkey or a cow or goat. And certainly, when you think about the criteria that you would use in your mind around what potential is, that he had absolutely no potential to change a world. And so, in his lifetime, he was a lucky guy because he ultimately lived through the generation of slaves that were freed in America. And along his pathway, his owners gave him a gift, which is the same gift that most immigrants and everyone else in the country, one of the best gifts that you could have gotten for your life potential, and that's education. Upon his release, his owners thought that the least he could have would be education. And so as they worked with him to be educated in Diamond Grove where he lived, he was rejected. He was rejected because he could not go to school with kids with more affluence or kids of another race. And so he was sent 10 miles from where he lived. And if you can imagine what 10 miles was with horse and buggy and no mass transit, that's a long journey. And so if you can think about what life would have been for Carver's George at that time, to leave what was familiar to sojourn in dangerous times where he could have been recaptured, he could have been lynched or put to death, what a sojourn to receive that education would have been like. Now some may say, well, I would take my chance at having a better life with little risk than I would to go back to what was familiar. But oftentimes it's human nature to stay with what's familiar. You know what that is. You've navigated it all the time. And so in this particular instance, he sojourned 10 miles away. And so if you can consider what would have grown in his mind about not having potential or who he could be or what he could be, it really would have taken a miraculous person to change his life. He later went on in his educational journey, those 10 miles, and he met a woman named Mariah Watkins. And Mariah Watkins did the most pivotal thing in the life of a person that you can do. She sowed a seed in his mind. And she told him, George, it is your task to learn as much as you can, and then to share with the world that which you've known, which was a life-changing seed in his life. Many of you who know American history or anything about agriculture will know that he went on to be Dr. George Washington Carver, an esteemed professor at Tuskegee University. But before he reached his professorship, he went on to change the world of agriculture for many of the people who even imprisoned him to slavery. He was able to take and help people understand how to preserve agricultural land and shift from crops like cotton to sweet potato and peanuts. And through the use of peanuts, he was able to cure many forms of malnutrition, as well as being one of the early leaders in alternative fuel from vegetation. Beyond that, he had 300 uses of the peanut, some of which were life-saving medicinal uses. And so he went on to become George Washington Carver and to change the world only because a woman believed that he had potential to be great and to be a world changer. Now this kid that you see at the left happens to be me. Now I know for those of you who were born in the 1980s, you're probably thinking to yourself, man, that's a funny looking shirt. But I would tell you, and the people who were born and lived in the 70s can tell you, I'm in fashion there. Plaids and big collar shirts, they'll come back one day. So I was born to two parents, and people tend to make judgments about who is worthy and who's not worthy. And so I was born to two parents, and my father was a veteran and my mother was a civil servant. And we grew up born into a middle-class household. And then my parents divorced, and there went a downward spiral. And we went from middle class to low class. Quite an experience. And so the movement from middle class to low class meant that I went from a kid who everybody thought would have potential to a community where, there's no potential. You know those kids who live in the poor places that live in those communities. And you know what happened in those places. And while there's some truth to it, and there's a lot of truth to it, if you consider, much like George, there often was a sojourn on my journey to the place that I'm at. And so I often reflect and think back on the life of what it is living in lower class communities. Oftentimes there's an isolation that grows. And if people don't decide to make sure that there's opportunity and that there's a worthiness, oftentimes you'll never make it out of those places. And so consider as a kid, oftentimes I grew up in a community where you had to have a plan and a strategy whenever you had a conversation with somebody. You wanted to make sure that when they said something to you, you didn't say something back, because in the end that meant that you probably would get beat up. Or your trip between your house and the corner store that was 2 blocks away, you had to have a mechanism. And so I'm not going to go on that block, I'm going to go around the back way and 3 blocks around to get bread, milk, and cheese and make sure I make it back home without a problem. And oftentimes, getting to school was an adventure. Now, this is the trick. And so we were raised in a community where back then in the 80s and 70s, there was something called school zoning. And so what school zoning meant was that you had to go to school in that neighborhood with the kids who were born and raised in that neighborhood. You couldn't go to the good school. You had to go to that school. And this was in the 80s and 90s, long after slavery. It's those structural forms. And so every day when I went to school, imagine what it's like growing up being a kid. Not to be able to imagine that you'd make it home from school every day safely without being gunned down, stabbed, or shot. Let it sit with you for a second. I was amongst thousands of kids in larger cities that had that experience. Along the pathway in high school, my mother was able to get me into a high school on the other side of town. And so when I say the other side of town, George's 10-mile walk was probably not much. 15 blocks to the train station at 5 o'clock in the morning, 3 trains across town, and another 8 blocks to the school building. And at moments it felt like, man, I know what it's like here, but I don't know what it's going to be like there. And so imagine in the mind of a 14-year-old what that's like every day. But like George Washington Carver, those of us who were bused into that district or transferred into that district, oftentimes there was a sense that those kids are from that neighborhood and they don't actually have potential and they'll never quite be successful in the way that we think. But I remember the turning point in high school. There were 2 women, Amy and Barbara. And actually one of the women was skinny like olive oil. I always remember her. She looked just like olive oil. And the 2 were a pair because the other one was a big African-American woman. I thought to myself, wow, they make a pair. But they believed in the potential of every kid. And I can remember every Saturday we would go to the community college to see what it was like to be on campus. And before long, because of their work, I began to believe that I would live to be 18. Because long before that, I questioned whether I would make it. And even though my mother would take us and show us to jail and show us the judges, I didn't see many judges like me, nor did I believe I would ever make it. And so through their work and intervention, they said to us, you can be great and you can change the world. And through their persistence, like George, they were world-changing. It was them that allowed me to escape the belief that we couldn't make it. And if you think to yourself the number of experiences that eroded a kid's opportunity or thought of potential success, I can remember my time as a freshman in college. My American civilization professor began to talk about the permanent underclass. How many of you have heard of the concept permanent underclass? It means that there is a class of people who will never be rich, middle class, they will always be poor. And as I opened up my textbook, the picture in the book was the housing project I grew up in. Imagine, if not for the fortitude built by those women who believed in the potential of every kid, I would have tanked at that very moment. And so many of my friends, instead of the pathway to college, the picture you see on the right is the pathway. And you may think to yourself, oh my God, that's so harsh to see a kid being fingerprinted. But that picture is actually a picture of the cradle prison pipeline study done by the Children's Defense Fund. What that shows on the cover is that prison construction is predicated on the number of kids by third grade that cannot read. Harsh reality, isn't it? And so in thousands and thousands of children, many will face that because somebody didn't cast a net to reach out for them. And so you may say to yourself, well, why is that important? Why should I care? I can go home to the place where I live and I have comfort and I'm safe. Oh, it'll just take care of itself. I'm here to tell you that it absolutely won't. That in the end, consider, we want miracles, we want great change in communities, and we think it'll come by a blue flashing light. It won't. We often overlook the potential and the gift that's given to us in every person. And so if you consider the little black boy in North St. Louis that's gunned down before he reaches his potential, a little white girl in the Blue Hills who never, ever, ever reaches her full potential, consider in the thousands of young people who die or who derail before they reach their full potential, and we often don't cast a net for them to draw them up, that with them dies the cure for HIV and AIDS, with them dies the cure for Alzheimer's, with them dies the cure for dementia, and then we consider ourselves looking for a cure. But it died because we failed to cast our net for their potential. And I know as a society we believe in rugged individualism, and if a person just works hard enough, they'll be able to do it. It's absolutely not true. If people are going to make it, it requires somebody to intervene. Even Bill Gates, if you read the book Ordinary People, everybody had somebody to help them to make it. And so we have a great opportunity, each of us, not to sit blindly or to make false judgments about who deserves and who doesn't, or who hit the birth lottery and they were born into the right family. But there's potential in each and every person. And by pulling everybody up so that they can participate, we then can repair the frayed edges of the American fabric, as well as re-sew the centered, tattered points in the middle. And then we can be, again, a great nation. Thank you.